Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, tonight it is 17 February 2022, and it's actually 9:14, 21:14 as I record this. Um, well, not gonna. I'm trying to keep up my cadence and kind of overburdened a little bit with work. It's probably an annoying thing that yeah, I'd like to change, but it's pretty much where I'm stuck for the moment. Hopefully, I'm on a trajectory that will rectify that at some point. I can imagine, um, a year from now, maybe things will be at least a little bit better there. Things are, I think, inflecting. It's been a long inflection, not so much just a point, but I think things are getting, at least in terms of my professional life, getting a little bit better, and they're going in a direction that's maybe good, although there's still a lot of lingering stuff that I'm not really enjoying, that really, some of it I just can't talk about, and a lot of it is just, I don't know. I would say it kind of comes down in a large sense to my own little microcosm of just how shitty a lot of things about capitalism are. And in particular, and here I'm going to speak in the abstract and not really speak about specific customers and things like this, but a lot of the stuff that we're working on. So I have my own few companies, and for the most part, we've raised a little bit of money, but for the most part, they're kind of like limping along. And then we have a spin-off company that does product design and development. That one is actually making money, and we're working on some new online services that I think slash hope will really be useful for a lot of people, because they're solving problems that we have and everybody that we ever encounter, both in terms of customers, in terms of design firms, and in terms of manufacturers. We all run into some of these problems over and over again. They seem pretty much universal, and there are some tools that kind of do what I think needs to be done, but they're very clunky, and none really just like nails it. And I think there's a good opportunity to nail it. I hope. Our initial build of this won't be like right there, but with some work and some massaging, I think we will have a very nice solution for this stuff. I'm speaking very abstractly, but it'll be more clear in the future when I talk more about it, what we're working on. But that aside, we still have, like, our primary source of income and revenue for the moment is doing product design and development for people. And the thing that gets me is just whether they're people who we've actually taken on as clients, or people who we've considered doing that for. For the most part, the people who have the most money have between like okay ideas, and a lot of them have ideas that are just fundamentally flawed in very big ways often. And when I say in big ways, I mean things that just like physically are not plausible, or and I don't want to speak about specific clients, but then it's hard to skirt around this one without naming anyone. But they're doing things where they may be physically possible in some sense, but their solution is orders of magnitude clunkier, more energy intensive. It's a technological solution for a problem that really fundamentally, it is a real problem they're trying to address, but their approach to it is really not, it's not good. It's just not practical. It's something that in the places where this problem is really severe, their solution probably won't work much at all. And even in the places where it's not that much of a problem, it's much more energy intensive and equipment intensive than much better, much simpler solutions. So it annoys me. It really does. And the thing that annoys me also is that they've raised a crap ton of money, like an offensive amount of money, including from people who have obscene amounts of money, and they're giving money to people who are trying, or, under the guise at least, or the idea of solving these actual problems. And this gets me to the topic for today, which is imagination. And the reason I think about a lot of stuff a lot. Obviously, it's not that I'm in mental loops exactly, but there are certain things that kind of keep coming up. But I think we're all kind of like that. We have, to some extent, I think a lot of us get some kind of idea and sort of circle the drain with it, and and I've talked about Einstein for this, but most people in their life, even like big, take Feynman. They do an amazing thing, but they're all kind of in the same, they rhyme. Let's just say that. They're doing stuff and they're solving things in a certain way and certain kinds of problems. Now they may be pretty different, but they kind of are using the same kinds of solutions to address the same kinds of problems. Einstein is one of the big exceptions to this, because you look at like his, I think his Nobel Prize was for a diffusion thing, which is a statistical mechanics thing, which was very elegant and really pretty fucking cool. And then you have special and general relativity. He worked on the photoelectric effect and a bunch of other things that are, they all have some things in common, and there are some parallels to how he approached them, but they're very, very different. I do think I like to think that I have more varied, kind of like in that direction, but I definitely am aware I have some thoughts that I keep coming back to, some ideas that I keep coming back to, some problems that I keep coming back to. and one of these, and getting back into this private equity thing, and where, like, who has the money, who's making the investments, what companies are getting funded, this kind of stuff, where research dollars are going, where development dollars are going. And you think about it, and unfortunately, a lot of it, not all, I'm not saying like all funded companies are bad, but a stupendous amount is for stuff like, just to give a couple of concrete examples, Uber and those fucking Lime garbage scooters that are littering the streets. Both of these are companies which would not exist, fundamentally would not exist, without massive amounts of private equity, of funding. And both of them are companies that, they're essentially just highly, highly subsidized. They operate at a loss. And if you charged what it actually costs to run them, for the drivers and the equipment, all of this kind of stuff, they'd be about, the scooters would be priced, I think, out of existence entirely. And the cars, the Uber shit, that stuff, if you charged what it would cost like a cab ride. There's a reason that cab rides cost what they did. And it's not that there's like a massive amount of padding there. It's that when you work out, like, what's the depreciation? What is the maintenance and the fuel? And what is human labor worth? And all of this kind of stuff. It works out to a certain amount, and you want to make a profit on top of that, probably, just because that's kind of how business works. And you have a certain cost for giving somebody a lift. And then you look at the literal Lyft and Uber and all of these other companies, and they, first off, they cheat, because that number is not really factoring in the equipment cost, none of the capital equipment costs, none of the consumables like fluids, fuel, repairs, anything like that. None of that is factored in. Now, hypothetically, the driver is going, well, okay, it costs me this much to have a car, it costs me this, or I get paid this much to drive, and then they're doing the equation. The problem is when you actually do the math on that, I think most people who are driving for them are not, they're maybe not really thinking that much beyond, okay, I've got a job, I'm getting money, that's okay. Because when you actually do the math, they're operating at a loss or just barely breaking even. And then you have the company skimming off of that on top of it. And you also have them kind of squeezing the drivers because they all want to charge, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's nice that you can go to an airport and have somebody pick you up and it's relatively cheap compared to a cab. But it's not economically viable other than through these subsidies. And it just fundamentally, it's not a great way to do stuff. And it annoys me, and it actually dovetails into the specific thing that I really want to talk about, which is Elon Musk, who, and in particular, I mean, I always kind of struggle a little bit with him because there are things that his companies do that are very cool. At least, I mean, SpaceX, I follow very, very closely. I like a lot of the stuff they're doing. I do think, like the Starship project, I feel like there's a very high chance that that will actually kind of work out. And yeah, I mean, I do think probably the orders of magnitude cost decrease might be optimistic, but I don't see any fundamental reason why a reusable launch vehicle won't work. I mean, there is certainly like the example of the Falcon 9, which, the boosters have been reused many times, many of the boosters. They're successfully landing to the point where if one fails now, it's shocking. Like, it used to be every time they'd attempt one, it would blow up. And now if one blows up or has any kind of a malfunction, it's really surprising. They just work. But the problem is they still need to be refurbished, which costs a lot of money. And it's not as expensive necessarily as building a new rocket, but it's not nearly as cheap as just like land it, refuel it, take it out. But then you look at the Starship, could they get there? I think it's possible. I do think there's a lot of risk of, like, they're not turning them around 3 times a day. Like it takes a month to turn them around. There's a reason why most launch vehicles that are reusable or semi-reusable generally have a pretty long turn time. And it's because, you're pushing, I mean, with rocket motors especially, you're pushing the limits of material science, of, pumps, and all of these things are getting like really stretched. You're nearly, I mean, for these rocket nozzles, things are operating at temperatures that should rightfully melt the things, and there are just various ways of cooling, either through like running fluid through them or actually like using fuel to cool them. These are things that, they're just operating on the edge of melting themselves and not being able to work. In terms of mass, they're just operating on the limit of like how much mass you can use to get a certain amount of mass to orbit or beyond. So it's hard, but it seems feasible. And then Tesla, I mean, I have a Tesla, mixed feelings about them. They're nice cars, kind of, not the greatest fit and finish. The automatic pilot FSD shit, I don't know. I could do a very long video on that, and I'm not going to because there are a bunch of people on YouTube doing FSD beta videos. And honestly, I mean, I do think that in time they're on a trajectory that will make that work pretty reliably. I also think, and being having some experience in the field of automation and kind of understanding a little bit about what they're doing and how they're doing it, they're not, their whole architecture is, I mean, their vision system is pretty good. The path planning and all of the stuff that's actually doing the real work beyond that, it's very far from, especially when you're talking about something that could actually like literally be called full self-driving. Even just like a level 3 automation where it's pretty much most of the time driving itself and you don't have to pay attention other than when it calls you. It's not anywhere near that. It's and it's not that it's like, oh, a couple updates from now they'll be there. It's more like a few years from now maybe they'll get there, and probably with a hardware update and probably with some fundamental either architecture changes or what they're doing can work with a lot of brute force, but it's a lot of brute force. And it's not really, they're building the supercomputer. It's a lot of brute force, but I think it's still probably orders of magnitude too little for the approach that they're taking. So I'm not really that bearish on that stuff. Bullish, I guess. Bearish. Either one. I don't think in the long run, as a company, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's true 20 years from now, every robot, every car will be made by Tesla. I don't fucking think so, but maybe. And I mean, that's the thing. It's just, I don't want to shit on the companies that much. I know people who work for them. I like things about them. They're mixed feelings, but yeah. But the thing that I want to talk about really, and Tesla is kind of like, they touch it a little bit. And I think the full self-driving, like the whole premise of we built this really cool car that accelerates really fast and it's a practical electrical vehicle. It's really fun to drive. Why would you even want that to be self-driving? Now, what would be really cool using a lot of the same technology, and this is something they could literally be shipping, like, I mean, obviously not today because they'd have to work on it a little bit, but they could just say, okay, we're going to work on this, and a month from now ship something that is actually production ready and much better. And this would be having the car not be full self-driving, not even aiming at that. Like maybe eventually this can get you there too. But they have the technology where you could say you're driving and then you momentarily, under certain circumstances, take your hands off the wheel, you go over here, you do something else, and then put yourself back in. You're not in full self-driving automation, but you have more like a plane's autopilot where you have to monitor it. It's not like, you're definitely not self-driving, or it's definitely not like fully autonomous. But there are conditions where you could just let the car go and it would actually be fine. I mean, on the freeway, for example, the autopilot on the freeway, other than things where, like you're coming up to traffic, it's pretty good. If it's just doing like lane keeping and speed keeping, I mean, there's a reason that's pretty good because, and I've said this before, that's stuff that you could literally, I'm not saying that you would use OpenCV for this, but you could literally, if you're a technically skilled person, download OpenCV, instrument up a vehicle, and over, I would say over a weekend, but say in a week or so, you could build something that does really pretty good lane keeping on the freeway. And if you put the right instruments in it, you could also do like, some following, like smart cruise control kind of stuff. That stuff is not that hard. Now, the problem is, of course, you go from that, which you're like, oh, look at this. I built that and it just works. Yeah, but then this happens or anything that is out of the ordinary happens, and it's just hard. A human driver monitoring that shit could understand the circumstance where it's good and you could just like let go, or reattach. And I'm not saying that you should or could do that necessarily, but they could build to that and it would work pretty well. Even today, in certain circumstances, as long as you're smart about where the circumstances are. And you could have the car kind of alert you, like, okay, here, like, I've got this. And then, yeah, you could, I don't know, I'm not suggesting like you're texting and driving, but you could arrange yourself, look something up, glance at the display, do some searching, figure some stuff out, and then move on to the next thing. And I mean, I think this is pretty much how, like in a plane, when you're on autopilot, you can just set up the autopilot, and when you're in cruise, the autopilot will take you through the cruise. You do have to do like radio monitoring, watch for traffic, make sure everything is okay, the engine's doing well, you're not doing, like the plane's not doing anything that's unexpected or crazy. But you can also like look at the map or look at an approach plate or do, things like this. Now, when you're driving, of course, you don't need to do the approach plates. You do have the map theoretically in the dash, although it's amazing, honestly, like how much, when you look at, and not even self-driving, but just like Google Maps, it's pretty good. Gives you a really good set of directions in terms of like broad strokes, how to get from A to B. But the last mile stuff, getting out of someplace onto the main part and getting from the main part into that last little bit, that's really hard as a mapping problem. It's really hard as an algorithmic problem. And it's something that still to this day does not really exist. And that's one of those things, like it's one of the reasons why, especially like this idea of robo-taxis, which are just essentially like level 4 autonomy and going out on their own. Like it's gonna leave your garage and go out and pick somebody up, take them someplace, drop them off, and then come back home. I'm not saying, obviously that's stuff that it's totally doable, but that's not happening tomorrow. And it's not happening, I mean, maybe in 5 years they'll get there. I don't know, but it's a ways away. It's not, maybe I'll eat my words here, but I'd be shocked. Especially, I was not like super optimistic about that before I got the full self-driving beta. And now that I have it, it's just not anywhere close. And it is very, I want to be careful and say like it is very impressive technology, but it's not anywhere near what they're trying to do. And to me, the problem fundamentally, and the reason that I'm talking about imagination, is I don't think Elon Musk has very good imagination. I just, like, I mean, part of it also is his worldview is based on individuals driving around in their own car. Which is a way to go, I guess. I'm not a fan. I've lived in, well, Paris in particular, but I've lived in places where they're walkable cities and they have good public transit. Accessibility in Paris leaves something to be desired, but public transit there is pretty good. You can get around, especially within Périphérique, and a little bit out. You can get around pretty well on the metro. RER will take you a little bit further out. There's stuff to do. There are buses and all kinds of other stuff. And it's also, I mean, it's a small, pretty dense city, so you can walk around it. I've walked end to end, basically the circumference of the thing, and it's not that bad to do. You wouldn't want to probably do that every day, but it's doable. I look at Tesla and this whole push for, like shitty individual cars that are kind of acting as public transit, but not. It looks shitty to me. It's not a good solution. I mean, in terms also like just of density of people, like you want to move 1,000 people around the city. If they're all individuals driving in individual cars, look at the fucking area that it takes for a road that can hold 1,000 cars. Not even like thinking about the whole part that's unoccupied at any time, just the part that those 1,000 cars are eating up. And then you look at how much surface area, how much just land is stolen by cars. It's really grotesque, honestly. And then you look at a train, for example, and it's just, I mean, there's no fucking comparison. It's such a simple thing. So Elon has this Boring Company thing, which started out as an idea of like evacuated tunnels and, oh, it's the Hyperloop. And, it's like, okay, maybe. It doesn't sound too bad. You can go very fast. And then you start looking at, well, making large scale vacuums is actually really hard. We're not going to do that. In his original plan, it was like they're going to be floating, essentially flying in the tunnels. We're not going to do that. We're going to do maglev, or now, like in Vegas, literally just put Teslas in the tunnels. And it's such a just dumb idea. And I mean, if you look at like the cost of those Teslas versus say the cost of a bus, you look at the cost of digging that tunnel versus, which is not very long, versus the bus on the existing roads or digging actual metro tunnels. And it's just, there's no fucking sense to it. It's dumb as fuck. And it's really offensive too, because public money, a lot of money and resources are going into digging these dumb fucking tunnels. And then putting cars with big battery packs into these tunnels that are so narrow that I look at these, I don't think you could get out of the car in the tunnel if one is on fire. Especially, like I don't think you're fully opening the doors on both sides. There's no real path to evacuate. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but lithium ion battery packs are pretty stable. They're pretty good, but they're not that stable and they're not that good. And at some point in the future, especially if they expand this, it is inevitable that there will be a fire with one of these. And you have to hope, I mean, first off, just the smoke from one will very rapidly fill the tunnel and probably kill a lot of people. And then you think about, well, if there's a chain reaction, like one car is on fire and then that one catches adjacent ones and then so on, that's a fucking catastrophe. It's not and if you think about that versus say trains, they've been developed technology for so long. If you go to back to Paris, they have Metro Line 1, which is autonomous. But you can have a driver on there, one driver for a train with how many people, versus these individual cars. Right now they have a driver. Eventually the promise is autonomy, but it speaks volumes, incidentally, about how far they are from autonomy, that they can't put an autonomous car in a tunnel that they've created. They control the tunnel. They've designed it. They can't build the autonomy system for that. And they're going to do that on the roads. It's like, it's pretty far. But it's also just dumb. It's like there's no... And when I say dumb, I do mean like, well, I mean like actually dumb, but also just... It shows such a lack of imagination, such a lack of like, well, this is how cities are now. And I mean, the way that he's thinking, it's really the same sort of level as people who think, oh, the freeway is really crowded, so we'll just add another lane, or add a couple lanes. We'll add a bunch of lanes. And not understanding induced demand, not understanding how networks work, not understanding how, like, okay, you could have 1,000 lanes on the freeway, but the on and off ramps are still going to be a bottleneck. Things don't just work magically that way. And the problem is, I mean, like, you can understand why somebody might think that. If you don't know anything and you haven't thought about the problem, then adding lanes just seems like a magical solution. And if adding lanes is a solution, then we're just going to drill them under the city. Never mind also that, you have to get property rights and figure out how to, you know, where you can build those tunnels and how much it's going to cost and all of that. Never mind also that, you know, he had this promise of like, oh, our drilling is going to be like 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper than the existing stuff. And they did make it, to be fair, they did make it kind of 10 times cheaper. And they did this by making like using off-the-shelf boring machines that are much, much smaller. So the cylinder that they're making is closer to a large drain pipe than, you know, like the kind of tunnel that you would want for public transit. Yeah, it's one of those things like, yeah, technically, I guess you solved the problem. You know, I wasn't that specific when I gave you the assignment. You got me, but it's just not this is not the kind of work of a genius, is all I'm saying. And then you have, I mean, like Mars also, I mean, if I like space a lot. I'm very interested in space. Mars is kind of cool, and I will be very excited. I do think at some point, maybe within the decade, we will land humans on the surface of Mars. It's coming soon. And barring some kind of horrible catastrophe, I think it's kind of coming. But the problem is, like, once you get there, Mars is not really a great place. You know, there are a lot of problems with it. It's got a lot of radiation, has no real substantial magnetic fields. Yeah, terraforming it sounds cool, but when you actually look at the amount of energy involved in, let's just say we want to build oceans and an atmosphere on Mars. Sounds like a cool idea, right? And we actually do have a bunch of comets that have tons of water in them. You start doing the math and you figure out like, okay, well, we have to bombard the planet continuously for this long period with all of these, and all of the energy that's going in there is pretty fucking substantial. Yeah, it ends up being that any kind of process that you're realistically doing, just from a pure thermodynamic argument, not even getting into like the logistics and solving like how do you do this stuff, just from heat dissipation, doing it in a time scale of hundreds of years is really pushing it. And which is not to say like I'm all for engineering projects that take 1,000 years. If you can have your civilization do it, that's pretty cool. And I'm also all for robotics and automation doing this kind of stuff. But you know, it's problematic. And now I'm not a fan of Bezos. Both of these guys can, you know, cease to exist, and I would say that the world would be better. But Bezos, at least, like his plan for space is more like space stations and you know, O'Neill cylinders and things like this, which also very challenging. But you can at least do that in a reasonable period of time, and you could build radiation shielding for something like that, and you could, you know, take a big rocky asteroid or a nickel iron asteroid and use that, convert it into parts, you know, mine it, all of this kind of stuff. You could see that as like some not completely absurd thing, but still, yeah. You just think about it like, what is the future? Where are we now? And they're trying to be visionaries, but the stuff that like they have no vision. They're visionaries who have shitty ideas that they got from books and comics and cartoons. And I love Star Trek, but yeah, and I do think it would be a much nicer, it would be a much cooler world or universe if eventually we can get out there and start really exploring. But it also, I mean, it would be really fucking cool, you know, in terms of the future. I mean, maybe, I want to be very careful here because I obviously there is a lot of people will go into this false dichotomy of like, oh, why are you spending money in space when you could be spending money here? I'm not that person. Spend money in space. It's very cool. I'd rather it be like NASA and government organizations than SpaceX giving massive subsidies to people like Elon Musk. But, you know, it's cool. I like it. But there are so many other things that we could do here to make a better future. And just the way that they're thinking about things, you can just feel they have no real ideas. The only ideas I think that Elon Musk ever gets are he reads these books and then he and his idiot brother get stoned in the fucking hot tub. They're like, oh, what if it's all a simulation? Yeah, I mean, these are like conversations that people have in undergrad or something, which, and I never even did that part, but I know it's like the kind of thing people would do. And it's just like, you know, why, man? This motherfucker has so many resources, and yeah, it's not just that I begrudge him for having so many resources, but we have a system which has given almost like demigod powers to really some of the horrible or some of the worst human beings on the planet. And also, I mean, you know, like you could imagine if somebody had $200 billion, but they were going to really tackle, say, world hunger, they could probably solve that problem. Now, Elon Musk recently put, I think, $6 billion into something, and you know, it sounded like, oh, it's charity to end world hunger. Sounded kind of good, and then you look into it, and it's like, well, he's probably really putting it into basically an account that he gets to control. It's you know, on paper, it's probably like honestly for tax liability, but you know, hopefully it'll do some good. But it's still, again, just shows such a lack of imagination. I mean, like these fucking NFT things, or I mean, blockchain just in general. There are definitely ways to use distributed systems that make sense. There are ways to do distributed storage, distributed compute that make sense and that are actually useful. Blockchains are by definition and by design intentionally massively inefficient. And it's not just that they're like super inefficient and slow, but they're actually designed so that the faster computers get, the slower they get, which means that they kind of, you know, when I was looking into this stuff years ago, it was like, oh, a single Bitcoin transaction would take a car, you know, 500-600 miles. And then a couple years ago, it was like, okay, it would take my Model 3 a couple thousand miles. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And it's just dumb. I'm so frustrated, honestly, with how it's not even that I mind that, like, obviously people can have all the dumb, idiotic ideas that they want. But the problem is, and again, this NFT and Bitcoin bullshit only exists because of private equity. If you took private equity out of the equation, these things would fucking collapse. They would not exist. Similarly, Uber would implode, fucking Lime bikes and all, or scooters rather, and all of the similar shit would just go away. And you think about it, all of these things are, and it's almost a cliche, but what's happening in Silicon Valley, what's happening in, you know, these venture-backed startups and all of this, mostly they're taking real problems, like our customer, weirdly enough, but they're taking a real problem, or actually I guess more than one of our customers, taking a real problem, and often they're problems which have very easy or well-known solutions. But instead of that, and instead of like doing, I don't know, public education, or instead of doing public transit, they're putting together, you know, a bunch of bullshit and essentially just conning people at some point. And then the people who get conned get in on the con because they want to be able to cash out and con the next person. So even if they find out that it's a con, if you invested a shit ton of money in Uber and you're like, oh shit, this fundamentally does not work, and they also, you know, lied to you and told you, oh yeah, we'll make these cars autonomous and then we can get rid of the driver, which is our big expense. Which sounds good until you think like, well, yeah, but the driver is fronting all of the capex for the company. So you're going to suddenly get rid of those drivers, but you're going to pay for the car and the autonomy system. not a cheap car, and the maintenance and the power and all that kind of shit. It's so fucking ridiculous. And so many of these things, I mean, Theranos is a great example of one that everybody sees was just a scam. WeWork was just a scam. And they're known to be scams, but so many of these other companies that have not imploded are still fucking scams. And it's just depressing. It's depressing because it's like, imagine what you could do, not even with hundreds of billions of dollars. If you had $1 billion and you just, you know, you wanted to work toward good public transit or walkable cities or something, you know, I don't know, feeding people, making sure that people have health care, actually trying to solve these problems. Yeah, now healthcare is not one that you could instantly solve for $1 billion. It's very expensive. But similarly, I mean, like, insurance companies do not exist as a business fundamentally in terms of, like, if you actually had them do the things that they're supposed to do, they would not work. Because realistically, you know, you're putting money into this big pot. I mean, the ideal of kind of in the super abstract, put money into a pot, we all put money in, and then when we need it, whoever needs it takes it out. Kind of, it actually sounds like from each according to their means and to each according to their needs, or, you know, whatever, but kind of sounds like that. But anyway, if you did that, that actually works. That is doable. NHS before the Tories, like, and even now still works. It's just really stretched. But instead you add to that, okay, we're gonna do this for profit, which means that we're going to take money in and spend as little as we can and try to, you know, basically keep as much as we can of that. It's just adding friction to, like, even if it was the best possible scenario for these companies, they're just adding a bunch of friction and waste and basically stealing money. And most of that waste just goes to administration and overhead and friction. You know, if you did this correctly and rationally, you would have tax revenue coming in, or, you know, the MMT people, you know, you're just making money and destroying money, whatever you want to, however you want to look at it. But the government is paying for this shit. People are paying into the pool in some sense, whether it's directly or, you know, inflation or whatever, however you're going to do it. But you do that and then have an efficient administration for it. It's just, it's much better. Now, there is the lie that private companies working for profit, they're going to be motivated to be as efficient as possible. And I mean, the thing is, kind of, but efficient as efficient as possible from the standpoint of making money means that what they're going to do is spend as little as possible and keep as much as possible and take in as much as possible. So they're raising the rates, giving fewer and worse services. And I mean, it's the same thing. Like if you look at utilities or, yeah, I mean, whether it's power or internet providers, we don't have good municipal internet. Just anything you look at. Now, I'm not saying that everything for profit is inherently bad, but when you're talking about essential services or real needs like food and healthcare, you know, at least for the baseline stuff, it does not do good things. It's a terrible way to organize a civilization. And fundamentally, I would say, like, you know, it would be nice to use some fucking imagination and come up with something better. I definitely, I will say this, I don't think like communism in the sense of the former Soviet Union, obviously I think we could say it had some problems. I know a lot of people who don't think that. I actually know people who think DPRK was okay or is okay. Probably not. They're not very good. But maybe there's another way, you know? Or maybe there are things that we could do. I don't know. I suspect. But with that, it's 10 o'clock now. I would like to take a walk before I go to bed just because I'm very sedentary and I'm sitting here looking at my computer all day and now standing here for another hour blathering. I will be back next week. I'm going to LA for the weekend, and then we'll be back to do one of these. But I probably will put this one out after I'm back, depending on schedule and timing and all that stuff. With that, as always, thank you for listening. And I'm sorry if my energy is down, but I am tired AF. So I've taken this AF thing to, like, though also has become THO for me. I've dropped the OUGH or the UGH. I don't know why. I really like it. But in the AF, I have no problem with saying as fuck. But I like the AF. Anyway, with that, thank you very much. Zaijian.